Item on the agenda, the report of Anna Záborská, Equal Opportunities and Equal Treatment of Men and Women in Matters of Employment and Occupation.
Și încep prin a-i da cuvântul.
I will give the floor to Mrs. Rapporteur, to Mrs. Záborská, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Commissioner, vážené kolegyne a kolegovia. Na úvod mi dovoľte poďakovať za spoluprácu tieňovým spravodajcom a členom výboru.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Commission and the committee staff for their cooperation. Although we didn't always agree, my impression was that our combined efforts will have enabled us to have secured real improvements in the condition of women. 3 years ago, the Bauer report addressed the question of equal opportunities and equal treatment of men and women. That report set out a series of measures for the Commission with a view to improving opportunities for women in the world of work. 3 years on, nothing has improved. This is why, in my report, I have focused on 4 key elements. First of all, reminding Member States that they need to introduce a uniform definition of equal opportunities. Secondly, improving access to justice. Thirdly, improving motivation of workers. And fourthly, addressing a demand to the Commission, asking it to ensure that the new directive takes on board all these proposals. The concept of equal opportunities and equal work has now been enshrined in law in 28 member states. In most of these states, the need for equal opportunities in the world of work is respected. However, since we haven't fully achieved our objectives, I think that these rules should now be made binding in all member states. And I think this would also help us improve the freedom of movement of workers in the European Union. 8, 19 and 11 of those paragraphs would need to be strengthened. We also need a neutral definition. In other words, neither men nor women should be given preferential treatment. I think this will help satisfy certain sensitivities. I would also like to suggest that we tighten up the powers of anti-discrimination authorities in member states, indeed extending their powers to the extent that women are no longer entitled simply to legal support, but also to direct representation when it comes to discrimination-related cases. Discrimination and inadequate access to legal recourse means that women are unable to see their rights enforced. In paragraph 33, we point out that businesses often fail to comply with their obligations when it comes to guaranteeing equal opportunity to public calls for tender. However, I would like to suggest that we, rather than prescribing penalties, that we try to motivate companies. Anybody advertising vacancies must ensure that men and women enjoy equal opportunities.
Croatian interpretation. We have just been announced. So I think, we should fix this. Is it okay? Good. Please continue. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Vážené kolegyne a kolegovia, povinnosť rovnakého zaobchádzania je zakotvená v zmluve.
So, as I was saying, the obligation to provide equal treatment is enshrined in the treaties. Since the 1960s, there has been a responsibility on the part of employers to ensure that this be complied with. In recent years, we've seen a stagnation in implementation. The time has now come to take a great step forward.
Thank you. I will give the floor to Commissioner Stylianides.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleagues, honorable members, On behalf of my dear colleague, Commissioner Vera Jourova, I'm here for this debate, and thank you so much for this important report. In particular, my dear colleague, Mrs. Anna Zaborska. And tackling pay discrimination, tackling the gender pay gap is an important commitment for the Commission. It's a real priority, and it has been for a very long time. But as your report reminds us, we still have work to do. Let me highlight at the outset, this is not only about fairness, but also an economic issue. Reduction of the gender pay gap is an investment in the future of the Union. There needs to be better use of women's skills to allow them to contribute more to the economy as a whole. There are clear benefits to this: improved recruitment and retention, reduction of skills mismatches, increase of motivation, productivity and image of the company, and increasing the female employment rate. The gender pay gap has numerous complex causes: occupational and vertical segregation, lower rates of female labour market participation. These are all relevant factors. It is also key to encourage a more balanced sharing of family responsibilities between women and men, so as to reduce the persistent gender pay and pension gaps. Equal pay legislation is an important part of the solution, but the broader mix of law and policy is equally relevant, both at national and EU level. Closing the gender pay gap therefore needs a comprehensive approach, with both legislative and non-legislative actions. It requires the efforts and commitment of all players, decision makers at EU and national level, as well as stakeholders. Effective application of the existing EU legal framework on equal pay is crucial for tackling pay inequality. I fully agree with you. This remains one of the biggest challenges. The Commission is therefore monitoring constantly whether EU law on equal pay is being correctly applied, and it supports Member States and other stakeholders with the proper enforcement of the existing rules. 2 years ago, the Commission published a report reviewing the application of the Gender Equality Recast Directive. This demonstrates to stakeholders what is required for more effective application of the existing legislation, with practical guidance on gender-neutral job classification systems, so as to assist Member States and employers in bringing the gender pay gap. Moreover, last year, the Commission adopted a recommendation on pay transparency. This provides Member States and stakeholders with a toolkit of concrete measures to tackle pay inequality and the gender pay gap. Pay transparency and gender-neutral job evaluation and evaluation systems in companies are crucial, because they reveal gender bias or discrimination in the pay structures of a company or industry. They support employers and social partners to take concrete action to ensure the effective implementation of the equal pay principle. But at the end of this year, Member States should notify to the Commission the national measures they have taken. In accordance with the recommendation, we will closely assess the situation and we will prepare a report on progress made in implementing the recommendation. On that basis, we will assess the potential need for additional measures. We will look specifically at measures to tackle pay discrimination, to ensure equality in occupational pension schemes, and to strengthen implementation and enforcement of the legislation. The core task of national equality bodies is to promote equal treatment and to provide independent assistance to victims of discrimination. Strengthening their role will improve enforcement in general, in particular in relation to equal pay. Effective, proportionate and dissuasive sanctions are crucial to provide a strong incentive for compliance with equal pay rules and to guarantee enforcement. Let's look at the bigger picture. We have also recently announced our plans for a new initiative in the area of work-life balance. We intend to support working parents and careers across the EU to strike a better work-life balance and to encourage more equal sharing of care responsibilities between women and men. These initiatives will help women to remain and advance in the labour market and thereby to tackle over the longer term the gender pay and pension gaps. As well as legislation, the Commission is also undertaking a number of policy and awareness-raising actions to address the gender pay gap. We are currently funding 8 multinational projects, around €2.5 million, which tackle different aspects of the gender pay gap in a concrete and targeted manner. The Commission will mark European Equal Pay Day on 2 November this year to make the gender pay gap plan an explicit for all Europeans and to draw attention to the fact that a pay gap still exists between men and women. This is the day women stop earning symbolically for the rest of the year. Honourable members, dear colleagues, thank you for this report. Again, the progress we are making is clearly not fast enough. We need to work together to ensure everyone steps up their efforts on this issue. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Blinkevičiūtė, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, colleagues. Firstly, I would like to underline that the implementation of the directive on equal opportunities of men and women on the labour market is stumbling in the member states. Thus, I would like to call for the revision of this directive as soon as possible because we need to deal with a long-lasting problem, the gender pay gap. This is by far the gravest violation of the principle of equal opportunities. Thus, as the rapporteur at the Employment Committee, I would like to urge the Member States to implement as efficiently as possible the Commission recommendation on the enhancement of the principle of equal pay for equal work by enhancing transparency. Secondly, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we see a lot of segregation on the labour market, and women usually are employed in lower paid sectors. They do undeclared, precarious work, including domestic work, babysitting, care for the elderly and the ill. These are hard jobs, but they are not valued properly and they are low paid. And finally, I would like to urge the European Commission to declare the year for the fight against the pay gap. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move on to speakers on behalf of the political group. Mrs. Le Grip has the floor for 1 minute and a half.
Thank you, President. Well, we have to note that despite all of the efforts that we've made, the European legislative arsenal, when it comes to equality between men and women, does indeed exist, but for some years now, the pay gap has been increasing and there's been increasing pay discrimination on the labour market. The situation has remained stagnant. We cannot simply sit on the fence. We have to be more effective. We have to be more credible. We have to achieve results. That's what our citizens expect of us. I'd like to thank Mrs. Záborská for drawing a very good state of play of the situation, a very honest state of play as to how the 2006 directive has been implemented. She notes the failings, the shortcomings, and she suggests what can actually be done in practice. The important thing is that we have to be precise and clear and provide clear solutions as well. She certainly provided plenty of food for thought. We need to consider sanctions to make the legislation credible in European companies. We need to reduce the pay gap. We need to use in-depth studies to try and distinguish between cases of genuine discrimination against women, which are, of course, absolutely intolerable, unjustifiable, and incomprehensible these days. And on the other hand, we need to consider the frequent obstacles, the glass ceilings that are placed in women's way. We need to see a recast proposal from the Commission on this legislation. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Ayala Sender, 2 minutes.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. We are here today to look at Ms. Záborska's report, and I should like to thank her very much indeed, although she herself had her reservations when it came to the vote, because we want to have a recast of the directive, we want to have an improved text, and we want to carry out a comprehensive evaluation on the directive on equal opportunities. It is unacceptable in Europe that we have this inequality between men and women, and equal treatment is not a reality in our democracies. We support the report and we fully subscribe to the need to promote in the Commission systems to evaluate and classify jobs and ensure that we have wage transparency, and that we also devise methodologies for evaluating the pay gap. So we need to do something to look at and remedy the pay gap, because companies need to apply a system where they have annual strategies to ensure equal treatment for both men and women, and that way women can better reconcile their family and working life, which for so many of them is so very difficult. We also need to have compulsory quotas of women in companies which are quoted on the stock exchange. We also need to have trade unions behind these demands, and of course with the next text from the Commission we need to have the best practice in various spheres. As the Commission has said, they exist internationally. As I say, there is more than a 15% gender pay gap right now, which is intolerable in our democracies. Thank you.
Mrs.
Wiśniewska, 1 minute.
President, ladies and gentlemen, the report on the updating of the directive on equality of genders at the workplace is very characteristic, because even the rapporteur has got a separate opinion on that. The document, which should be a practical and pragmatic attempt at solving the problem of unequal treatment at the place of work, is full of ideological elements. It talks about the need to combine gender issues on training, professional education, and the need of accepting the sex change, gender change, and additional audit procedures. It is very strange that all references to biological sex have been transformed into gender references. Motherhood is typical only of women, and it is not surprising that it affects women's career, professional career. Obviously we need to work in order to equalize pays, but it is not the right path if we talk about the duties, additional information duties imposed upon employers. Those competencies are those activities should not suggest that women are less competent, and the European Commission cannot adopt a pragmatical approach. ECR will vote against.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bearder. 2 minutes.
Thank you. Equal treatment of men and women is a fundamental value of EU law, and the principle of equal pay has been enshrined in the treaty since 1957. Despite this long-standing commitment to equality, progress remains far too slow. The gender pay gap and gender pension gap still show significant differences. It is gender that we're talking about, not biological sex. Women are effectively punished because of society's expectations that they will bear children, regardless of whether they have them or not. Single women without children earn less than their male colleagues. Marriage and children are irrelevant to women's earning potential. Women earn less whether they have husbands or children or not. And as the gender pay gap stands, on average, European women work 60 days without pay compared to European men. Employers might think this is good value, but it's shocking that it still happens. The best way to tackle wage inequality is to improve wage transparency, but despite years of various instruments, the problem persists. The time has now come for stronger action. We need mandatory wage transparency and committed action from governments and businesses alike. Large companies listed on the stock exchanges in member states should be obliged to publish their data so that employees can see for themselves whether they are getting a fair deal. They have to publish other financial data, so requirement is not too onerous. And related to this, we must protect the independence and funding of national equality bodies who assist in cases of unfair treatment and protect them from political interference. I'm also delighted to see language in this report ensuring trans people are protected under equality legislation. A recent study found 1/3 of trans people reported discrimination when seeking employment at work. Trans women earn 20% less than their other female colleagues, and they are punished doubly for being a woman and for being trans. We need improved trans-inclusive diversity training and legal gender recognition across our member states, as well as equality for women in the labour market now. Thank you.
Mulțumim și noi.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Zuber, 1 minute.
Obrigada.
Thank you very much, President. This report supports fundamental principles and measures for creating equality in the workplace. I'll give you some examples. Collective bargaining and the attacks that are being made against collective bargaining. They give value to the role played by unions in trying to fight for equal treatment and the principle of equal pay in the workplace. Assessment systems for professional classification have to be based on collective bargaining results. And member states need to guarantee rights linked to maternity. For example, preventing people from being abusively sacked when they get pregnant or when they lose their job after returning or demoted after the end of their maternity leave. We need to revert the burden of proof so that we can ensure that companies do not discriminate. Now we need all of these ideas to go from the page into reality. In too many countries, discrimination against women continues to take place. And we also need to make sure that other texts approved by this Parliament do not contradict these principles.
Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, how many times are we going to have reports on equality in this Parliament when we have member states who are not courageous enough? The situation is truly dramatic when it comes to the pay gap. When you look at the numbers, look at the latest data, then women's wages in the EU are on average 16.4% lower this year, 17.3% in 2013. Are we really going to have to wait another 71 years for true wage equality to be established between men and women? In actual fact, the principle that applies across the European Union is equal pay for equal work. That is one of the underlying principles of the European Union. So it's high time now things changed. Because, you know, wage equality is just a symbol. Then you've got the whole issue, of course, of pensions, because you need to be aware of the fact that women, on average, receive pensions that are 39% lower than men. So notwithstanding this directive that was adopted in 2013, which called on companies to have at least 40% of women on their boards, well, that's still not been enforced. So what are we supposed to do now? I mean, I think that the watchword here is sanctions. So if you've got people who don't respect the principle of equality, then there must be sanctions, and that applies to companies as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. AIUTO, 1 minute and a half.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Ladies and gentlemen, we had the opportunity recently to study in greater depth the question of employment for women in Europe in a FEM committee meeting in Ireland during a visit to the Eurofound Foundation. It became clear in that meeting that the situation is worrying, if not alarming. As far as the gender gap within employment is concerned, the percentage difference in Europe is approximately 10%, with peaks in countries such as Italy, my own country for example, with a gap of as much as 20% for those between the age of 20 and 30. This means that not enough has been done over the last few years, either in terms of labour policy or indeed family welfare and measures for people with very young children. Only by adopting specific measures will be able to bring down the shamefully high percentage. The gender gap and its severity in the European Union means that we have a 16% difference. There are obviously cultural issues at stake because of the discriminatory practices which exist in all member states. The ZÁBORSKÁ report refers back to legislation adopted in 2006. So we agree with the general thrust of this file. However, we remain opposed to the introduction of penalties and excessive red tape, which we believe will further exacerbate the administrative burden which companies are already faced with. We think it's a good thing to fight against discrimination, but we shouldn't persist too much in punishing those who give jobs.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie.
Thank you very much indeed, President. I'd like to thank my colleague, Ms. Záborská, for this very thorough job of work, and I share her concern that we should promote access to the labour market for women, particularly women who have families and who have children. And I also approve of this desire to allow women to work at home, self-employed women in particular, to enjoy better social protection. And I'm also delighted that the situation of the most fragile and vulnerable in our society is taken into account, particularly isolated single mothers living below the poverty level in our country. Families, however, will have been disappointed by the fact that your text essentially has been overburdened with all kinds of considerations which have absolutely nothing to do with the main point of the report, which is to apply equal opportunities and equal treatment between men and women in employment and occupation. You know, what's all this about gender, race and ethnic origin in this report? You know, why do you need to draw a distinction between lesbian and bisexual women and other women? You know, what's this about sex change, transsexualism? In the report there are many references to sex changes and transsexualism in the report, and I've counted them all. Now, these are isolated cases, and I don't think that they would want to be singled out in any way. I really do think, however, that in principle this report is worthy of praise, but the LGBT lobby has distorted it, and I very much regret this.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Morvai, 1 minute.
Köszönöm. A jelentésnek a Q pont.
Thank you very much. Well, I would maybe just like to quote one part of the report, and I have a question for Mrs. Záborská and the Commissioner. Well, this is number Q. You say that women face a danger of multiple discrimination, and you talk about the minorities, lesbian women, etc., etc., etc. Well, what I would like to ask you, Mrs. Záborská, who I very much appreciate. She's a Slovak Christian Democrat, conservative, and I appreciate her work very much. So I would like to ask her if you shouldn't also mention the differences and discrimination between women from the west of Europe and women from the east of Europe. Some nurses earn 10 times as much in the west of Europe as they do in Eastern Europe. Isn't that a kind of discrimination? I'd also like to put the same question to the Commission.
Thank you. Mrs. Corazza Bildt, 1 minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is clear that much more needs to be done to ensure equality for women in employment. The principle of equal pay for equal job still is not respected, and in all the member states. This creates inequality even later, when women have lower pensions. Member states should take concrete measures to eliminate gender pay gap, including addressing the root causes. And I welcome, Commissioner, your work both on transparency and on evaluation. To have a job, economic independence are key for women equality. And in particular now, I would like to say, for the integration of migrant women in our society. We need to create the conditions for all women to access the labour market without discrimination. The selection criteria should be based on competence and skills. It should be easier for women to start a business, to be entrepreneurs. And it is crucial that women empowerment, as you said, Commissioner, it's also for the benefit of the European economy and growth. Women and men should also have the same opportunity to combine family and career. Mothers are not the only parent responsible for taking care of children, and member states should promote shared parental responsibility. Equality at work is also about removing stereotypes and changing mentality. Mr. Chairman, too many women are still victims of sexual harassment at work, and as long as women are considered more for how they look rather from how they perform at work, inequality will not be achieved. Mr. Chairman, our fight for equal treatment should not be ideological, imposing a model. It's about women's individual choice and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Corazza Bildt, will you accept a blue card from Mr. SZANYI? Mr. SZANYI, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the chance to ask this question. You said that the member states had to take steps. Well, I could take one example here, the example of Hungary. The school books were, they're put together by the government, and in one Hungarian textbook it says that boys are much better at maths than girls. That is stated in an official Hungarian school textbook. And this was put together by the Fidesz party. Fidesz is part of your political group, I'll remind you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I regret what my colleague said. I think that there should be no discrimination at school between girls and boys. I'm not aware of what we are saying, but this debate is about the school is a national issue. So we are not dealing with school text in the European Parliament, but we definitely deal with non-discrimination, as I said, and this is very much the policy of all the EPP group. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Head, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. Well, me and Anna Záborská don't always share the same political values, but I would like to thank her very much for this report. The situation on the labour market is absolutely catastrophic when it comes to the principle of equal pay for equal work and for pensions. And inequality isn't only present in the employment market. It's something that's not only quantified in economic terms. Inequality in society depends on how we look at and think about women. Company boards continue to include only women. Women continue to do lots of unpaid housework, and there's a lot of prejudice about women's role. When some of the people on the right and Mrs. Záborská talk about these issues, quite often you get the impression that their priority is giving housework a higher status. Well, that is important, but how are we going to ensure that housewives get a higher economic income? When are we actually going to deal with the real problem here, which is to try and ensure that men take their responsibility, so they work more at home, that they look after children and take responsibility?
Thank you very much. You have a blue card. Do you accept it? You have a blue card from Mr. Agnew. Do you accept it, the blue card?
Thank you. I'd just like to ask the Speaker, you used the term housewife and you're in the S&D. Are you aware that this is a politically incorrect term? If I was to use the word housewife in Britain, I would be branded as a woman hater.
Well, that wasn't actually the word I used in the original. That must have been the interpreter, and your interpreter apologizes. I talked about women who work at home. I didn't say the word housewife. That isn't a term that we use in Sweden. Not anymore, at least.
Thank you very much. Mrs. von Storch, 1 minute.
Ja, sehr geehrter Herr Präsident, wir reden heute über...
Thank you, President. We're talking about the ZÁBORSKÁ report today, and I don't think the report actually deserves the denomination report. It's simply not good enough. I'd like to quote page 16, data protection and monitoring. The Parliament calls on the Commission and Member States to ensure that supervisory and control measures be introduced and to set up effective supervisory systems and to register data regarding harassment with a view to improving the gender situation. A Europe-wide monitoring system for harassment. Wonderful, fantastic. A second point I'd like to focus on. We reiterate the importance of clear definitions when it comes to the gender pay gap, for example. That's very important. We do indeed need clear definitions. What is gender? What is sexual identity? So what's sexual identity, gender identity? What on earth is all this stuff? So let's start by identifying and defining that, then we'll know what...
Thank you. Thank you. Will you accept a blue card from Mr. Etheridge?
Doamna von Storch, acceptați?
Mrs. von Storch, will you accept it?
Thank you. I was just wondering if after that speech I agreed with very much in many parts, do you agree with me how remarkable it is that every time we speak about equalities in this place, it's never mentioned that the new people who come to this continent, the migrants from other parts of the world, have vastly different ways of looking at equality between men and women, and maybe that should be addressed when people come here, that they come from totally different cultures, and that's an area that doesn't even get discussed, where women are treated far inferior in the places they've come from.
Ja, ich glaube, dass es wichtig ist.
Indeed. I think it's important, given what you've just said, that we establish a clear definition of exactly what we're talking about. Acceptance of gender and sexual diversity. Sounds fantastic, doesn't it? But I think we just start by clearly defining what we mean by this. And then we can explain to the many millions of refugees coming to the European Union, we can explain to them exactly what's meant by the of diversity of gender.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, President. I think that the gender pay gap and austerity policies and gender violence are a clear example of just how little the institutions are doing, along with the member states which make up the European Union, in order to actually apply the equality policies and gender equality policies that we have. There are too many shortcomings, and I would like to use my speaking time to ask the Commission precisely what it intends to do in practice to eliminate the gender inequality which exists right now in applying these policies. In practice, what are you going to do when you apply these directives to fight against gender violence? And what affirmative action, what policies are you going to use? Because if we don't move forward, then we will have to simply limit ourselves to analyzing the situation of women in various sectors year in, year out, and we'll be in the same situation.
There is a blue card for you. From Mr. Nuttall.
Thank you very much for taking this blue card. I'm a bit confused, really, because I looked at your group yesterday and the day before, and you're all sitting there with refugees welcome signs all on your front tables. Do you not agree with me that violence against women will increase if we allow more and more people onto this continent who are coming from countries where the word of a woman is in some cases worth only half of that of a man, and generally who treat women in an appalling fashion? Do you not agree with me? If we allow more people to come to this country from the Middle East, from Muslim countries, violence against women will naturally increase.
So, would you care to answer?
Te ha preguntado si estás de acuerdo en que la igualdad de género va a aumentar si entran más refugiados. Te he hecho una pregunta. Si va a haber más problemas de igualdad de género.
The translation of the question.
Te ha preguntado.
Disculpa.
Terribly sorry. Well, this question really doesn't make much sense to me, because gender violence exists and it will continue to exist if we do not take proactive measures.
Thank you. Mrs. Bours, 2 minutes.
Hello, thank you, Chairman. Well, you all seem in a pretty confused state to me. You don't really know what it is you actually want. You've now started to completely contradict yourselves, which I know is absolutely nothing new for this place, but now it's so blatant. In paragraph 34, you call for EU gender-neutral job classifications and evaluation systems, yet in paragraph 13, you demand the introduction of binding gender quotas. So, well, what is it? Jobs based on the gender of a person, or jobs irrespective of the gender? Do you want to fight discrimination, or don't you? In paragraph 37, you call for EU mandatory pay audits for listed companies in order to obtain gender data. You call for the introduction of sanctions at EU level that would exclude companies from procurement of goods and services financed with public subsidies. So are you saying you want the EU to block companies from using public goods, services and money if there isn't an appropriate gender balance? In paragraph 41, you call for a reversal in the burden of proof between employer and employee. Now, are you aware this would require a complete alteration of the UK judicial system? We'll just throw away, shall we, the concept of innocent until proven guilty. And finally, in paragraph 50, you want the EU to conduct a study on the situations of working mothers, mothers who choose to stay at home, and women without children who have made the choice to work. And why? To find out how each affects the labour market. It's almost as if you want to belittle those who don't conform to your view of what the role of a woman should be. Please, do something useful. Let's talk about FGM. Let's talk about forced marriage. Let's speak out about the abuses of women across the world. But please, just stop wasting all of our time.
Thank you. Mr. Fontoulis, 1 minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, for years you say that you've been trying to achieve equality in the workplace. Have you ever wondered why you're getting nowhere? You cannot realize that your approach is wrong. Because you're all very individualistic and you cannot accept that the cell of society is the family. You keep pushing people towards consumerism. You want equality at all costs, and you cannot realize that you'll end up flattening everything. The word you're looking for is not equality, it's harmony. Harmony between the sexes, harmony between all members of a society. You have even gotten into the job of trying to see what educating children means in terms of money, and at the same time you're saying nothing about the role of the family.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Niebler, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. Colleagues, I'd like to start by thanking the rapporteur, Mrs. Anna Záborská, for her report, and this is of course an initiative report. Over the last few decades, on equality and equal treatment, a lot has been done in the European Union, but there's still quite a need for improvement, particularly when we're talking about the pay gap. If we're going to get a grip on this problem, what are we going to have to do? First of all, we need to analyze the causes. Why have we ended up with this pay gap? Well, of course, the first reason is that women have lots of breaks in their career. They spend time looking after their families, and it can be difficult to combine this with a career. Women tend to go into less well-paid jobs. There are quite a few causes. What we need to ensure is that it's possible to continue in work and to return to work when you need to. A lot has to be done through collective bargaining. There's not that much that we can do as legislators, because we don't want to interfere in the freedom for firms and unions to decide upon in the workplace.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tarabella.
Merci, Président.
Thank you, President. I would like to start by commending Ms. Záborská for her commitment to this issue while setting out the weaknesses and proposing remedies. In my own report earlier in the year about gender disparities, like Ms. Delli said a few minutes ago, we have to wait for more than 70 years till we achieve gender equality. That's far too long. This means we do need coercive measures to try to improve the situation. The choice you've made, Commissioner, is symbolic, since this means that as from November, women actually work for nothing. The 2nd of November is a day in which we commemorate the dead. I hope you won't make the opportunity to bury this whole file. What's important in this whole struggle is to fight against gender stereotypes, which are reinforced when people enter the labour market. We have to start doing this in the world of education or at the training level, so as to avoid this scourge of sexist stereotyping. Finally, I think we have to try to improve compatibility between working life and family life. All too often women are obliged or feel themselves obliged to give up their job to look after the family. You have to
Thank you.
Well.
ŽITњANSKÁ.
Thank you very much, Mrs. ŽITњANSKÁ. 1 minute.
Veľmi pekne, pán predsedajúci. Správa veľmi dobre pomenúva problém, ktorý osobne považujem za...
Thank you very much, President. I think this problem is very important, but I have one specific issue that I think is important. There are parents who want to look after their children with disabilities. I think it's a shame when the care of these children can be a problem when people are in poverty. And I'm thinking of the problem of the female nature of poverty. I think that we need to ensure that conditions on the employment market are improved so that these women can find work. It's not enough to combat discrimination on paper. We can only change the situation when these kinds of women are no longer seen as being less valuable on the labour market. They may be at home looking after older people or disabled children, so this should not be stigmatized.
Thank you. You have 2 blue cards from Mrs. Morvai and Mr. Epitideos.
Sfontoulis. Yeah, sorry. Would you accept the blue card from our colleague?
Είναι πάρα πολύ ωραία.
Those things you said are actually very nice. However, I would like to disagree on a particular point, because I am the father of a child with special needs. I have a 32-year-old daughter with Down syndrome. The care of the child does not fall alone on the shoulders of the mother. In many families, the weight is shouldered equally between the father and the mother. Do you agree with that?
Máte pravdu, je veľa rodín, kde aj otec...
Well, you're absolutely right there. There are many families where fathers do bear part of the burden. But unfortunately, in my own personal experience, in many families where there is a disabled child in the family, then in many cases the family breaks down and it ends up being the mother who has to bear all of the burden. And that has a major effect on her future pension as well. So I'm very sad when I...
Thank you, Mrs. González. 1 minute.
La igualdad de trato y la no...
Equality of treatment and non-discrimination between men and women is not only an issue of justice, but is also a right enshrined in the European Union treaties, and is also a historical debt. And that is why we need to look at Europe's economic and social development and the sustainability of our societies. The report we are debating this morning shows that the directive is not being effectively applied by member states, and we continue to have a 16.4% pay gap between men and women. And if we simply leave to one side the 50% of the European population, then that is no way of contributing to our stability or prosperity. And that is why measures are required, because companies must be obliged to ensure equality of treatment in their workplace, and we need other measures too to guarantee the dignity for home workers and care workers, and also ensure that there is co-responsibility between men and women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zarianopoulos. 1 minute.
Ανησυχεί η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση για την ισότητα των γυναικών στην...
The EU is supposedly worried about inequality of women in the workplace. I mean, women in the workplace are the victim of the European Union. With the memoranda, what they did, they brought everybody's salary down, women or men. We have now the third memorandum in Greece, and that practically means that pensions are abolished, especially for women. Age limits are going up even by 17 years, and undeclared work has gone up. People are even forced to work on Sunday, and especially benefits that went to the poorer women have been cut. The minimum pension has gone from 500 to 390 euros, and even the private pension systems are making things worse. So there's only one way: clash with the government.
Thank you, Ms.
I would like to congratulate Madam Záborská for her dedication and consistency in her work. This report shows that equal pay for equal work is a must, and this type of discrimination cannot be tolerated anymore, especially if the 15% gender pay gap translated into days amounts to 60 days more of work that women need to put in yearly. So we need to ask ourselves a question: which society wants to have half of its potential left untapped? I'm sure that no society wishes this type of scenario. But also the question poses: how many more times are we going to deal with this same or similar type of reports? In the past years we have not done enough, but I would like to agree that this is a culturological or civilizational issue, and that member states need to take action, and we need to ensure the dignity of women in the workplace. And therefore I expect of the Commission to implement better control, to conduct a review of some sort, because this is the only way forward. Thank you.
Se sei donna lavori.
If a woman works as much as a man, she earns less. That's what the data proves. The figure is currently 16%, as is pointed out in the report. In some areas in Europe, however, this percentage figure can reach really worrying levels, 20–25%. Let's ask ourselves why. Are women less productive? Are they less skilled? Do they have less knowledge? Do they work less hard at the workplace? If that were true, that might support this situation. However, we can't actually find rational reasons for this gender pay gap. Equal opportunities and equal treatment is something which has been enshrined in the treaties of the European Union since 1957. However, the figures show that we're still far from actually implementing that principle. Perhaps we haven't been working with sufficient determination in the right frame of mind. We know that a directive alone won't be enough to do away with prejudice. However, we would support the Commission's endeavour with the new directive to call on Member States to show greater commitment.
Thank you, Mrs. Esteras, for 1 minute.
Sí, gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much indeed, President. Indeed, Ms. Zaborska has done an extraordinary job of work, and I should like to commend her for that. This report, of course, was necessary because of the 16.4 percentage pay gap between men and women, much higher in certain member states. Now, we have a legal framework in the European Union. Nevertheless, the directive has not been used by member states properly to revise the national systems productively in order to stamp out this kind of discrimination. So what the Commission now needs to do is to recast the directive. It needs to come forward with a new directive, look at things that have not worked or have worked, look at issues relating to pensions as well, because we need to also provide protection for the most vulnerable sectors. We need to look as well at people with disabilities, sexual minorities too.
Thank you. There is a blue card for you from Mr. Blanco Lopez. Will you accept it?
Puteți să puneți întrebarea.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. I heard Mrs. Estara saying that there are member states in which the pay gap is greater. I would like to point out that since 2011, data shows that in the European Union the situation has got worse. How is it possible that in Spain this gender gap has grown by 8%? Is this due to the government's labour policy and equal opportunities policies?
Gracias, señor.
Thank you very much, President. The Spanish government's labour reform has made it possible, following on from a socialist government which left us with 4 million plus unemployed, a possibility for us to create jobs. We've had a serious crisis, the very first time creating jobs in Spain, and that's, trying to recover from the terrible situation which we were left.
Thank you. We move on to the Catch the Eye procedure. There are 8 colleagues who like to speak, so I would ask them to speak for 1 minute. Mrs. Mussolini has the floor.
Peccato perché il testo parla.
Well, I think it's a bit of a shame because the text talks about the pay gap, which is, of course, is very important for women in Italy in particular. But when we talk about the reversing the burden of proof and obligatory penalties and denying companies access to public tendering processes for European funds, well, I think that that's a bit too much. This really introduces a new legal case, of multiple discrimination. I think that this text becomes discriminatory against women. One woman is only discriminated against, but another woman has got multiple discrimination, so that's an extra level of discrimination. Discrimination is a single thing. It can't be Category 1 discrimination case and a Category B discrimination case, not a second division case. So I'm going to be voting against if this isn't corrected.
Domnul Blanco Lopez, un minut.
Thank you, Mr. Blanco Lopez, for 1 minute.
Señor Presidente.
Thank you, President. As has just been demonstrated, the pay gap is something which has to be addressed at the very top of our political agenda. Until we correct this problem, there will be no social justice, and we will continue to feed into this discrimination. I said beforehand that in the European Union as a whole, the pay gap has stabilized. So we now have this proposal for a new directive to end it. The situation is still dramatic in many member states. Despite what's been said, when labour reforms are pushed through, all too often the question of gender pay gaps are disregarded and job insecurity is increased, and this means that women face further discrimination, as we've seen in my own country. We saw a labour reform which led to greater job insecurity, and this also exacerbated the gender pay gap. And the gender pay gap, as I pointed out, is now increased by 8% compared to 2008. We can't simply turn up all of this.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Tomasic, 1 minute.
Equal opportunities for women and men. This is something which hasn't yielded results so far because there was no serious insistence on proper implementation of legislation. And therefore I regret that we are not ready for a shift, a turn in approach to this issue. But we rather only suggest to intensify additionally our efforts in the same direction. The piling up of regulations can only additionally burden European companies, and this will negatively reflect on all the employees, men and women. Our main goal must be to have as many people working and not less. The suggested annual business plans dealing with equality and training of employees on the topic of equality and diversity is mere form without function, and it will not change a thing. The only difference will be that due to increased costs, a certain number of employees, regardless of their gender, will lose their jobs, and the legislation will not implement itself.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Husmanova, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. To improve the European labour market, it is very important that the gender equality policy be implemented in practice. Women in Europe should be economically independent, and they should receive just rewards. They should be able to count on a work-pay balance, and there is no glass ceiling. We should add to this a genuine sector balance. It requires improving women's access to typically male professions and improving men's access to typically female jobs in education. In Bulgaria, education is a barrier. For instance, men are not encouraged to become teachers. We need to change this. There are possibilities to do it, and it is important because both sexes have their contribution to make to education and ultimately to equality of...
Thank you, Mrs. Grappini. 1 minute. Thank you, Mr. President. I agree with the thrust of this report, but what are the chances of it being applied when, Commissioner, you say that this report is important, but then, and this boggles our imagination, you say that we need to help women, to help them with their skills. What are you saying, that women are unskilled, that they need our help? Where in countries where women are the majority, there women in top jobs, where they were talking about the leadership of the state, well, these jobs are held by men. Then who decides then? Men decide. And you don't say that that's why the women are discriminated. Don't say that women are discriminated because they are unskilled. This is why I must say I am disappointed. This is what you think. We don't want positive discrimination. We women don't want positive discrimination. We want you to value merit, and if women are majority in a state, you can't have women not being present in top jobs. And then education is another problem. You cannot have school cookbooks that depict women cooking, and the speaker is being interrupted. We need to see how the legislation is being put into place.
1 minute.
Dear Chairman, many years now the EU has been making efforts in order to bridge the wage gap. However, we see that the wage gap is still there. Women are paid at least 16% lower than men. Women are also overrepresented in part-time jobs, and they are underrepresented in full-time jobs. Also, the pensions of women are 39% lower on average. Now, concerning the countries that are in the so-called bailout programs, it's especially women that have been hit harder from the austerity measures. In Greece, according to 2015 data, women have 30% unemployment percentage, whereas men have 23% unemployment. So we should do something immediately.
Domnul Jakovčić.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jakovčić, 1 minute.
This House likes to style itself the home of European democracy. Today we are going to discuss 4 cases of breaches of human rights in the world. And today we're discussing a topic that is being examined as if we were in the Middle Ages. There are some who declined to support this report. They live in the Middle Ages. If we today still have to discuss equality among men and women, and if some refuse voluntarily to understand that they live in the Middle Ages. I'm sorry to have listened to certain arguments that were brought against this report and that have no footing whatsoever. They oppose the very essence of what equality is.
Caputo.
Thank you, Mr. Caputo.
Grazie Presidente. Non è la prima volta che intervengo in...
Thank you very much indeed. This is not the first time we have talked about women's rights and gender equality in this chamber, because unfortunately we are still far off achieving our objectives, and that is why a recast of the directive will be most welcome. European Union's strategy for equal treatment for 2015 is needed because women are underrepresented in parliaments, in national governments, as well as in companies, particularly large companies. Now, steps forward have been taken in many sectors, but you'll need more than 80 years to close the gap between men and women if we continue at this pace, and that is why we need to look at the 20–25% of women who experience violence at least once in their lives, including in the workplace, and we must make sure that European legislation is there to secure equal rights for both men and women, but we will have to...
Thank you very much. Commissioner, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much for this very rich discussion. And after this, I'm all the more convinced that closing the gender pay gap needs a comprehensive approach. That means legislative and non-legislative measures, and of course efforts from all the relevant stakeholders at both EU and national level. The effective application and enforcement of equal pay in Member States is essential, so as to ensure the rights enshrined in the directive. This remains the biggest challenge. Going forward, the Commission will examine national measures following the recommendation on pay transparency. We will assess the need for any additional measures at EU level. Of course, this will include looking at whether we should indeed review the Gender Equality Recast Directive. Thank you so much.
Mulțumim, doamna Záborská.
Thank you, Mrs. Záborská.
Pán predseda, pán komisár, kolegyne a kolegovia.
President, Commissioner, colleagues, I should like to thank you all for this very productive debate, and I have heard support for many of the ideas which I attempted to incorporate into my report, and I should specifically like to thank you for those words of support. But there were also many references to a number of problems, but a lot of them were not covered by my report. Ms. Morvai raised a number of very interesting issues, but my report is not specifically looking at the situation in Central and Eastern Europe, and I can't unfortunately respond to all comments that were made, so perhaps just to pick out a few symbolically. Now, this is an initiative report from the committee, and often when it comes to the debate in the chamber, it reminds you of a party, and you have baked a fish, and it might smell very nice, but there are too many bones in it, and you simply can't swallow it, you can't digest it. So some of the bones might be very small, and you can swallow them, but some of the bones would be far too big and far too unpleasant, therefore, and that is why I have attempted to draw attention to this particularly problematic issues by using split votes. So, as I say, there are some big problems, if you like, what I'm calling the large bones in the fish, and we've got Article 80 as well as Article 42, and for years I have been making the point that the use of the term gender is not suitable here because we have no proper definition of the term gender, and indeed it is used quite differently, whether you're talking about the media, depending on whether it's the media or academic reports, and of course there are different translations which might have all kinds of different implications, and I tried to take that into account in drafting the report. Now, in spite of my best efforts, as I say, this report is not to my taste, and I will have to abstain, therefore.
Thank you. The debate is closed. The vote takes place today. And now we move on to the next item on the agenda. An oral question to the Commission. Implementation of Article 22 of the Service Directive and Article 8(3) of Directive on Consumer Rights. I would now give the floor to those who have asked the question. Mrs. Gebhardt, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Here I am. So once again, thank you. I'm grateful that we have the opportunity to debate this today. There is an ongoing problem with internet purchases where citizens are unable to complete purchases because they have the wrong IP address, the wrong credit card data, the wrong nationality, they live in the wrong country, and so on. All those reasons mean that all too often consumers aren't able to purchase things on internet. EU law is quite clear. Discrimination on the basis of nationality is outlawed. This is why I find it quite astounding that in the enormous single market which we have in the European Union, which generates great profits for companies, the single market does not really exist for the men and women who want to buy products on it. This is why it's so important that we in the European Parliament address this issue. In the Commission communication on strategy for a digital single market for Europe, the Commission said by 2016 the Commission wants to bring an end to unjustified blocking on the internet, on e-commerce. It wants to create a suitable legal basis for electronic business. I'd like to know exactly what you mean with this change. What types of changes will this bring about? What's your purpose? I would also be interested in knowing what the European Commission intends to do with Article 22 of the Services Directive and Article 83 of the Consumer Rights Directive. Those rights exist in theory and have done for a long time now, but in practice they don't really have any tangible benefits for consumers. I'd be grateful if you could answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schwab for 2 minutes.
Herr Präsident,
President, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. This question to the Commission today gives us an opportunity to make clear something that we have tried to clarify in the Services Directive and the Consumer Rights Directive, namely that we have inequality of treatment of consumers on the grounds of either their nationality or location. These are only permissible if there are compelling legal reasons for such discrimination, and we are trying to make sure that the legal parameters are in place so as to outlaw discriminatory treatment in future. Now, we're aware of the fact that we need to carry out a number of simplifications to make sure that consumers in future can rely on uniform regulatory machinery. Now, there was a situation in the summer which showed